The lantern light flickered against the rough wooden beams of the barn, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to mock her trembling hands. Hannah held her breath, listening intently for the heavy crunch of boots on gravel, praying that her father remained asleep in the main house. Every violent beat of her terrified heart felt like a loud drum against her ribs. She knew that being out here past curfew was a transgression that could invite severe discipline from the elders and shame upon her family. Yet the small, folded piece of paper burning a hole in her apron pocket felt heavier than any punishment they could ever inflict. She had to read it again, just one more time, before the sun rose. The morning sun eventually broke over the rolling hills of Lancaster, painting the frost-covered fields in brilliant shades of orange and pale gold. Hannah moved through her chores with practiced efficiency, milking the cows and scattering feed for the chickens, her face a mask of calm obedience. Inside, however, her mind was a tempest of conflicting thoughts and dangerous new desires. Her world was defined by boundaries, from the fences that lined their property to the strict rules governing her dress and speech. There was comfort in the predictability of the ordering, a safety in knowing exactly what was expected of her every single day. But lately, the silence of the farm felt less like peace and more like a suffocating weight. She often caught herself staring at the road that ran parallel to their land, watching the silver cars flash by like meteors from another universe. They represented a speed and chaos that her people rejected, yet she felt a tug in her chest whenever she saw them. It was a curiosity she dared not voice, a small seed of rebellion taking root. Miles away, in a world of steel and glass, Caleb sat in a crowded coffee shop, surrounded by the incessant hum of digital noise. He was a photographer chasing authenticity in a world that felt increasingly manufactured, looking for something real to capture through his lens. The city felt gray and exhausting, draining his spirit with its relentless, demanding pace. He had decided to take a month off, renting a small, dilapidated cabin on the edge of Amish country to find quiet and clarity. He wanted to photograph landscapes where the earth hadn't been paved over, seeking a connection to something older and more permanent. He packed his bags with a desperate hope that silence would heal his loud, fractured mind. Caleb arrived in the late afternoon, his tires crunching loudly on the dirt road that bordered Hannah's family farm. The contrast was immediate and jarring, the air smelling of turned earth and wood smoke instead of exhaust and stale coffee. He stepped out of his car, breathing in the cool air, feeling the tightness in his shoulders begin to slowly loosen. Their first meeting happened 3 days later, near the boundary where the old oak fence had begun to rot and lean dangerously. Hannah was struggling to pull a stray goat back from the roadside, her boots slipping in the mud. Caleb saw her struggle from the road and instinctively jogged over, vaulting the wooden rails to offer his help without thinking. He grabbed the goat's collar, steadying the animal, while Hannah quickly clipped the lead rope, her hands brushing against his for a fleeting second. She pulled back as if burned, her eyes wide with shock, staring at this stranger in strange clothes. No words were spoken in that moment, but the air between them crackled with a sudden, intense energy. Hannah stared at the ground, remembering her teachings about interacting with the English. But she could not help glancing up at his face. He looked different from the men she knew, with kind eyes that held a question she could not answer. He stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of apology, respecting the invisible wall that stood between them. He murmured a quiet apology for startling her, his voice low and distinct against the backdrop of the wind rustling the cornstalks. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and turned to lead the goat back toward the barn without speaking. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a mix of fear and a thrill she had never felt. That night, Hannah could not focus on her prayers, her mind drifting back to the blue of his eyes and the warmth of his hand. She felt a guilt so profound it made her stomach ache, yet she replayed the moment over and over. It was the first time she had been looked at as a person, not just a daughter. Caleb returned to the fence the next day, not knowing why, but feeling drawn to the spot where he had seen her. He brought his camera, but left it in the bag, feeling that taking a photo would be an invasion of her privacy. He waited for an hour, watching the clouds drift, until he saw her figure in the distance. She was walking the perimeter, checking the fence line. She stopped when she saw him standing there, waiting patiently on the other side. She did not run away this time, though every instinct told her to flee back to the safety of the house. She approached slowly, keeping a safe distance, her curiosity overpowering her ingrained fear of the outside. He spoke first, asking about the goat, keeping the conversation simple and harmless to avoid frightening her away again. She answered in a whisper, her English accented with the lilt of Pennsylvania Dutch, her eyes darting to the house. They spoke for only 2 minutes, but it felt like hours of intimacy, a bridge being built across a vast cultural chasm. These meetings became a ritual, occurring in the gray light of early morning or the dusky haze of twilight. They stood on opposite sides of the fence, discussing the weather, the harvest, and eventually the things that mattered. Hannah found herself speaking of her love for the quiet mornings, and Caleb shared his exhaustion with the noise of the modern world. She learned that he was lonely, despite being surrounded by millions of people, a concept that was foreign to her tight-knit community. He learned that she felt trapped, despite being surrounded by family and faith, a paradox that fascinated him. They were two lonely souls finding a strange resonance in each other, a harmony that defied their disparate worlds. One evening, Caleb reached through the fence and offered her a small, smooth stone he had found in the creek bed. It was a simple gesture, a gift of no monetary value, but to Hannah, it was a treasure beyond measure. She hid it in her pocket, her fingers tracing its cool surface, feeling a connection to him that terrified her. The emotional intimacy deepened with every secret conversation, moving beyond small talk into the realm of dreams and hidden fears. Hannah confessed that she sometimes wished she could see the ocean, a vastness she had only read about in books. Caleb described the salt spray and the roar of the waves, painting a picture with words that made her weep. But with the deepening bond came the rising tide of danger, the risk of discovery growing with every stolen moment they shared. Her father had begun to ask why her chores were taking longer, his eyes narrowing with a suspicion that made her blood run cold. The community was small, and whispers traveled faster than the wind across the open wheat fields. One Sunday, during the long church service held in her uncle's barn, Hannah felt the heavy gaze of the bishop upon her, wondered if he could see the sin written on her heart, the secret affection she harbored for an outsider. The sermon was about separation from the world, and every word felt like a stone thrown directly at her. Fear began to eat at her, a gnawing anxiety that shadowed her every step, turning her sanctuary into a prison of paranoia. She knew the consequences of her actions could be shunning, a total separation from everyone and everything she had ever known. To leave would mean losing her family forever, a price she wasn't sure she could pay. Caleb sensed her withdrawal, the way she would glance over her shoulder constantly, her body tense and ready to bolt. He hated that he was the cause of her fear, yet he could not bring himself to stay away from her. He found himself falling in love with her quiet strength, her deep connection to the earth, and her faith. He brought her a book about the ocean, hiding it in a hollow tree near the creek where they sometimes met. Hannah retrieved it with trembling hands, devouring the pictures in the safety of the hayloft by the light of a lantern. The images of blue water and white sand stirred a hunger in her that was almost physical. Rumors began to circulate in the community about a dark car scene parked too often near the Miller farm's southern boundary. Hannah's mother asked her gently if she had seen anyone, her voice laced with a worry that cut Hannah to the bone. She lied to her mother's face, a sin that felt heavy and black on her soul. The moral tension became unbearable. A constant war between the duty she owed her parents and the awakening of her own heart. She loved her life, the rhythm of the seasons, the closeness of her community, and the simplicity of her days. But Caleb represented a freedom of thought, a validation of her individuality that she had starved for. One afternoon, her brother almost caught them. Walking down the path just moments after Caleb had slipped back into the woods, Hannah had pretended to be fixing a fence post, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. Her brother had looked at her strangely, sensing something was wrong, but he had said nothing and walked away. That close call served as a wake-up call, a stark reminder that they were playing a dangerous game with no happy ending. Caleb told her the next day that he couldn't keep putting her at risk, that they needed to make a choice. He asked her to meet him that night properly, to decide what they were going to do. Hannah spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of her life while her mind raced. She looked at her parents, her siblings, the house that had sheltered her since birth, and felt a wave of grief. She knew that meeting him tonight would be the crossing of a line from which there was no return. The sun set in a blaze of red, signaling the end of another day and the beginning of the most important night of her life. She waited until the house was silent, until the rhythmic breathing of her sister in the next bed was deep and even. She dressed in the dark, her hands shaking as she pinned her bonnet, feeling like a thief. She slipped out the back door, the hinges groaning softly in the stillness, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot. She paused, waiting for a shout or a footstep, but the house remained quiet, wrapped in the slumber of the innocent. She stepped into the cool night air, the grass wet with dew against her boots. The walk to the creek felt like a pilgrimage, a journey through the darkness toward a flickering hope or a devastating end. The moon was hidden behind clouds, leaving her to navigate by memory and the faint outline of the trees. She felt the weight of her ancestors watching her, their judgment heavy in the humid night air. She reached the meeting spot, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, her eyes scanning the shadows for his form. Caleb stepped out from behind the old oak tree, his face pale in the darkness, his expression serious and filled with longing. Fear did not touch her, respecting the gravity of the moment, the precipice upon which they both stood. He told her that he was leaving in 2 days, that his time in the cabin was up, and he had to return to the city. The news hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and leaving her feeling hollowed out. This was it, the moment she had dreaded, the fork in the road she had tried to ignore. Caleb looked at her, his voice breaking as he told her that she could come with him, that he would take care of her. He offered her a life of freedom, of oceans and art, a life where she could be whoever she wanted to be. It was a dazzling, terrifying offer, a key to a cage she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. Hannah looked at him, tears streaming down her face, her heart torn cleanly in two by the impossible choice before her. She thought of her mother's hands kneading dough, her father's voice reading the Bible, the smell of the barn in winter. Looked at Caleb, the man who saw her soul, and knew that whatever she chose, she would lose. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead, whispering secrets that only the trees could understand in the darkness. They stood in the silence, 2 figures on the edge of 2 different worlds, bound by love but separated by everything else. The decision hung in the air between them, heavy and final, waiting to be made. "I cannot be who you are, and I cannot make you who I am," she whispered, the truth of it shattering the quiet night. She took a step closer to him, allowing herself this one moment of proximity, this one memory to hold on to. The distance between them was mere inches, yet it spanned centuries of tradition and belief. As Caleb reached out his hand, palm open in a final invitation, A sudden light flared from the direction of the farmhouse. The beam of the flashlight cut through the mist like a blade, swinging wildly across the fields before settling on the path behind them. The chirping of the crickets seemed to cease instantly, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of impending discovery. The smell of rain was thick in the air, mixing with the sharp, metallic scent of pure adrenaline. Hannah froze, her eyes locked on the distant beam, her entire body rigid with the terror of being found. Caleb reacted instantly, pulling her into the deep shadow of the oak tree, shielding her body with his own. They held their breath, their hearts beating in a frantic, synchronized rhythm against the encroaching danger. The light lingered for a moment on the fence line, sweeping back and forth, searching for the source of the noise or movement. A voice called out, distant and muffled by the wind, but unmistakably the voice of her father calling her name. The sound of it tore through Hannah, a mix of love and authority that demanded an answer she could not give. Caleb looked down at her, seeing the sheer panic in her eyes, and knew that the romantic dream was collapsing under the weight of reality. He whispered that she had to go, that if they were found together, her life here would be over immediately. He was willing to be caught to save her, to claim he was alone, but she shook her head violently. They waited in the agonizing silence until the flashlight beam turned away, bobbing back toward the house, defeated by the darkness. The relief was physical, causing Hannah's knees to buckle, but it was quickly replaced by a crushing realization. This could not continue. The risk was too great, the cost too high for everyone involved. She looked up at Caleb, seeing the desperation in his face, the silent plea for her to run away with him right now. It would be so easy to get in his car, to drive until the fields turned into highways and the silence turned into noise. But as the adrenaline faded, the ancient roots of her faith began to tighten their grip on her ankles. "I can't go," she whispered, the words scraping her throat like broken glass, painful and final. She saw the light in his eyes dim, a profound sadness washing over his features as the reality of her choice settled in. He didn't argue, didn't try to pull her, because he loved her enough to understand the weight of her soul. "I know," Caleb replied softly, his voice thick with unshed tears and the resignation of a man who has lost before he began. He understood that uprooting a flower often killed it, and he knew that her spirit was tied to this land. To take her would be to destroy the very essence of the woman he had fallen in love with. They stood there for a long time, the silence between them no longer charged with electricity, but heavy with grief. This was the breaking point, the moment where love bowed its head to duty, where passion surrendered to peace. It wasn't a rejection of him, but an acceptance of herself, a painful embracing of her identity. Hannah reached out and took his hand, her rough working fingers interlacing with his for the first and last time. She memorized the texture of his skin, the warmth of his palm, storing the sensation away in the deepest vault of her memory. This touch would have to last her a lifetime, a secret comfort for the lonely years ahead. "You showed me the world," she said, her voice steady now, grounded in the certainty of her difficult decision. "You showed me that I have a choice, and that makes staying my own decision, not just a rule." It was a profound truth. He had given her freedom, and she was using it to choose her chains. Caleb nodded, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle, lingering kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of reverence, a farewell that carried more weight than any desperate embrace or passionate declaration could have. "I will never forget you, Hannah," he promised, and she knew it was a vow he would keep. She turned away before her resolve could crumble, stepping back onto the path that led to the farmhouse and her future. She did not look back, knowing that if she saw him one more time, she might not have the strength to leave. The walk back was the hardest journey of her life, every step a physical effort against the pull of her heart. She slipped back into her house, the warmth of the kitchen wrapping around her like a familiar, suffocating blanket. She crept up the stairs and lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. Outside, she heard the faint sound of an engine starting, a car driving away, fading into the distance until it was gone. The days that followed were a blur of gray routine, the color drained from the world with Caleb's departure. Hannah went through the motions of milking, baking, and praying. Her body present, but her spirit wandering the roads she would never travel. Her family noticed her quietness, attributing it to a winter mood, never suspecting the heartbreak she carried. She found solace in the work, letting the rhythm of the farm stitch the pieces of her heart back together, however imperfectly. She worked harder than before, finding a strange peace in the exhaustion, a way to silence the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. The farm was her anchor, holding her steady when the waves of grief tried to pull her under. Seasons changed, the winter frost giving way to the green shoots of spring, the cycle of life continuing indifferent to her loss. Hannah watched the wheat grow, seeing in its resilience a reflection of her own ability to survive the harsh winters of the soul. She was still Hannah, still Amish, but she was different, deepened by a sorrow that had expanded her capacity to feel. She often walked to the fence line, looking at the spot where the old oak tree stood, guarding the ghost of their meetings. The fence had been repaired, the rotting wood replaced with strong new timber, a barrier restored and reinforced. She no longer wished to cross it, but she honored the memory of the time she had almost dared to. One afternoon, she found the stone he had given her, tucked away in the bottom of her sewing basket. She held it, feeling the cool weight, and realized that the sharp pain of loss had dulled into a quiet, aching bruise. It was no longer a wound that bled, but a scar that reminded her she had truly lived. Years passed, and the sharp edges of the memory softened, becoming a part of the tapestry of her life. Hannah eventually married a kind man from a neighboring district, a widower who needed a mother for his children. He was a good man, steady and devout, and though she loved him, a small part of her remained locked away. She was a good wife and a devoted mother, raising her children with the same values she had chosen to uphold. But sometimes, when the wind blew from the east, smelling of rain in distant places, she would pause in her work. She would look toward the horizon, wondering where he was, if he had found his ocean, if he was happy. Caleb never returned to Lancaster, keeping his promise to let her live the life she had chosen in peace. He traveled the world, photographing the oceans and mountains he had described to her, capturing the beauty of the earth. But in every gallery show and every collection, there was always one photo that stood out from the rest. It was a black and white image of an old wooden fence, with a single hand resting on the weathered rail. The caption simply read "The Boundary," and no one understood the depth of emotion hidden in the grain of the film. It was his tribute to her, a silent message sent out into the world, acknowledging the love that had changed him. Hannah found a contentment in her life, a quiet joy in the laughter of her children and the stability of her community. She understood now that freedom wasn't just about going wherever you wanted, but about being at peace with where you were. She had chosen her path, and while it wasn't the one of passion, it was one of purpose. The bitterness of the ending lay in the what if, the shadow life that walked beside her real one, unseen but felt. She wondered who she would have been if she had gotten in that car, if she had chosen the other world. But the sweetness lay in the certainty that she had been loved, truly and deeply, by someone who saw her. On quiet evenings, when the house was asleep and the fire had burned down to embers, Hannah allowed herself to remember. She didn't dwell on the sadness, but on the beauty of the connection, the spark that had burned so briefly and brightly. It was a secret jewel she carried, a hidden warmth that helped her navigate the cold days. She taught her children to look at the stars, to appreciate the beauty of the world. planting seeds of curiosity she carefully tended. She didn't want them to leave, but she wanted them to see, to understand that the world was vast. It was her subtle legacy, the influence of the outsider woven into the fabric of her Amish life. One autumn day, a package arrived at the general store addressed to her, with no return address on the brown paper. Inside was a book of photography filled with breathtaking images of the sea, of waves crashing against cliffs. There was no note, no signature, just the images speaking a language she understood perfectly. She hid the book in her chest, beneath her wedding quilt, a private window to a world she would never visit. It was his way of saying goodbye, of showing her that he had carried her dreams with him to the ocean. She ran her fingers over the glossy pages, feeling the spray of the sea through the paper, and smiled through her tears. The love story didn't end with a wedding or a dramatic escape, but with a quiet, enduring respect between two souls. They were separated by miles and cultures, by fences and faith, yet connected by a single, transformative month. It was a love that didn't need possession to be real, a bond that survived in the silence. Hannah lived her life fully, finding grace in the ordinary, her heart anchored in her faith, but expanded by her memory. She grew old with dignity, her face lined by the sun and the years, her eyes still holding a spark of the girl by the fence. She was whole, not broken, a woman who had chosen her sacrifice and found peace within it. As she sat on her porch in the twilight of her life, watching the fireflies dance in the cornfields, she felt a sense of completion. The wind rustled the leaves, sounding like a whisper, like a promise kept across time and distance. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of the earth, and whispered a quiet thank you to the dark. The story of the Amish girl and the English boy faded into the folklore of the hills, a whisper in the wheat. But for Hannah, it was the chapter that defined the book, the sorrow that made the joy more precious. She had loved an outsider, and in letting him go, she had found herself.